Hi, how's everybody doing? Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited about our conversation with Attorney General Phil Weiser. This session is brought to you by the Outdoor Industry Association and the Outdoor Foundation. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho First Nations. We'd like to honor and thank them. I also want to take a moment to recognize my ancestors and the elders in the room whose knowledge and work we're building upon today. And I also want to thank you. You all are giving your most valuable asset, and that asset is your time. So I'm very excited to go ahead and get started by introducing Attorney General Phil Weiser. Attorney General Weiser has a very diverse resume and background, from serving as the law clerk to U.S. Supreme Court Justices Byron R. White and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to professor of law, and I'm going to get this right because I have my notes, professor of law and Hatfield Professor of Law, and the Dean of the University of Colorado Law School, where he founded the Silicon Flatiron,
Sorry.
You've never heard that, have you? Center for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship, and co-chaired the Colorado Innovation Council. Attorney General Weiser has also served in various high-level capacities under two sitting presidents, President Clinton and President Obama, and now as Colorado's Chief Legal Officer, is committed to protecting the people of Colorado by addressing a slate of issues, from addressing our opioid epidemic, reforming the criminal justice system, and protecting Colorado's land, air, and water. The son and grandson of Holocaust survivors, Attorney General Weiser's passion for justice runs deep. It's a pleasure to share space with you today, Attorney General. Do you want to say a few words before I get started?
I would, Stephanie. I appreciate the introduction and the acknowledgement about ancestors and how we got here. I think it's worth thinking about in this conversation, trauma. There's a book on the bestsellers list, something to the effect of how the body remembers trauma. And there's research that trauma goes through generations. So we think about indigenous peoples, for example. The trauma that indigenous peoples in this country have endured over generations reverberates. And in all of our lives, there's trauma that reverberates from how our parents and grandparents lived. That trauma is part of why we have an opioid epidemic problem in our country. Another major problem is pharmaceutical companies irresponsibly and wrongfully pushing out products they knew were highly addictive, which found their ways into people's hands, who then developed those addictions. And in many cases, in fact, 70-80% of the cases, people started with pills, moved to using heroin. And so as we think about this conversation, I just start with that thought about how trauma affects us and how people deal with trauma.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very, very true. And I know you have an opportunity with your recent initiative, the Healthy Youth and Strong Communities Fund. But before we dig into the actual content of that initiative, I'd like to better understand. I know you're very much a lover of the outdoors and a champion for the outdoor industry and just the outdoors as a whole. Can you talk a little bit about your background and what brought you to that love and passion for the outdoors, and how that background informs your work as Attorney General?
Well, first, most of us who are here in Colorado by choice are here in significant part because of what our outdoors mean to us. And I want to start in a contemporary way, which is, over this pandemic, my family and I, in addition to getting a pandemic puppy, as many did, we also appreciated anew and even more profoundly what the outdoors means. And during a time when stress and trauma were building up for all of us, the ability to go outdoors, the ability to hike, was an incredible place for us to de-stress, for us to be together. I know many people had that experience over this past year, and one of the opportunities for this industry, which, as you know, I am a passionate supporter of, is how do we reflect on this connection between the outdoors, outdoor recreation, mental health, and trauma.
Absolutely. We talked yesterday about the outdoors really having a moment right now, and how we can really capitalize on the movement or moment in a way that contributes to the movement, because it truly is an injustice that not every person in our country has access to the outdoors. And that's a big piece of our work at the foundation through our Thrive Outside initiative, is connecting youth and families in underserved communities to the outdoors, along with many other amazing organizations that are doing this work and industry partners. And that's one thing that I think is really unique to the Healthy Youth Strong Communities Fund, is that it truly is an innovative partnership between your agency and other public sector agencies, and United, who is a private sector stakeholder, and a number of nonprofits and direct service providers on the ground. And you know, the time is now, and you talked about trauma and the urgency and threats to our planet, and addiction, you know, rates skyrocketing. It's an urgent need. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the fund and about how it came to be and your role in it. And if you can also touch on how you see the implementation rolling out and the AG's role on it, with a lens towards learning, so that other states and potential partnerships can use what you've learned.
Stephanie, I want to thank you for your leadership. It's really special, and I don't take this for granted that you and the foundation wanted to have this conversation, have raised this conversation. I think for your industry's leadership, that is extraordinarily commendable. I want to thank also Luis Benitez, who many of us know and adore at VF, who helped facilitate this conversation and is supporting this initiative, working with people from my office, including Alex Baker and Samantha Mooney, who are here with me today. This takes a village. Part of what this initiative turns on, and there was a lot of work that went into this, conversations I had years ago as a candidate even, there's an idea of how do we build up, and the association is called the Colorado Youth Corps Association, as a platform for some of those individuals you mentioned. And there are multiple strands here that we're drawing on. One, this point about trauma, substance abuse, challenges around mental health is absolutely a core part of it. Another one is, how does our school system interact with that trauma? At our best, it's with empathy, with a focus on restorative justice, and with an awareness that decisions made about how young people are treated have lifelong effects. When you choose to arrest a young person and label them a criminal, we know from data analysis it's very likely they will spend a significant portion of their whole life in the criminal justice system. By contrast, if you take a step back and look for a diversion program and say, you're struggling with a lot of trauma. Maybe you have only one parent at home. Maybe you have domestic violence at home. Maybe you have other substance abuse in your family. Who knows? How about you take a summer outdoors with behavioral health support and with the goal of helping you become your best authentic self? Think about that moment and how we as a society react. The fact is, we can do better. And during the pandemic, we've seen this trauma exacerbate. Many more people died around substance abuse overdose, mostly opioids, in 2020 than ever before. So we have this opportunity, and when we were talking to United Health Group, which won this major lawsuit, that it had funds coming to it because it had purchased this Colorado nonprofit, it had a choice to make, how to use that money. And I am a strong advocate for supporting youth mental health, and I advocated to invest in this partnership, and we will continue advocating to others, including those in the outdoor industry. This is worthy of your investment of time, energy, money, because the difference this initiative can make, both in saving lives, suicide prevention is a part of what we're focused on, and in transforming lives. And we're working with Mile High Youth Corps to do this special effort. We believe it will be a national model.
That's great. It sounds like when we're thinking about lessons that other states can take and other potential public agencies and private sector stakeholders to build these partnerships. You mentioned Luis, and his role as a leader in the sort of private sector, but also in government affairs and his background in policy. What other sort of components or ingredients existed in the creation of this fund that you think are good lessons for others perhaps in the room or that will be listening could take and say, we want to start something like this in New Mexico, which is where I'm from? And yeah, can you speak a little to that?
A couple of points come to mind. First is about relationships, and second is a culture around collaborative problem solving.
Right.
Luis is your quintessential connector. He got the value of this. And so in addition to Colorado Youth Corps I mentioned, and Mile High Youth Corps, the Rocky Mountain Youth Corps and the Western Colorado Conservation Corps also came to the table interested in working on a program. Relatedly, but also separately, we were talking to our Boys and Girls Clubs. We have a great network of Boys and Girls Clubs here in Colorado, and of this $5 million commitment that United Health Group made, 1.8 goes to the outdoor rec initiative we've been talking about.
Right.
An additional 1.5 million went to support Boys and Girls Clubs, where suicide prevention, healing, again, positive, constructive mentoring are all part and parcel of what they do. And then additional funds went to suicide prevention efforts as well around the state. And so in addition to the relationships and spirit of collaborative problem solving, you need to get individuals who are willing to invest money to see what you can do. And part of that is a spirit of innovative experimentation. We in Colorado believe this model can work. We've got funders willing to get behind it. And then the challenge is going to be, once we show the proof of concept, how do we as a society, both public and private sectors, continue to invest in this? One of the painful points, and this is the point that animates my commitment to criminal justice reform, is our criminal justice system often ends up as a last resort for dealing with societal challenges that we haven't found the strength, the imagination, or the moral courage to deal with otherwise. The number of people who have spent time serving a sentence in jail or prison because of their struggles with substance abuse, it's a national shame that we haven't found better ways to support people. The number of people who are young people who were shuttled into the criminal justice system because we didn't have the time, awareness, or resources to have diversion programs like the one we're talking about, it's also a national shame. Shame on us for not doing better. And, speaking of shame, part of how we got the money was a willingness to use our moral authority. I went to an undergraduate college who's had a mantra of guilt is good. I personally believe in using guilt to encourage people, moral shaming, if you will, or moral exhorting, if you will, because all of us have a moral responsibility. We're here for one another. And as we come out of the pandemic, I'd love to see us asking that question more. How do we support each other? How do we support young people? How do we support people struggling with trauma?
Thank you for that, Attorney General Weiser. You're speaking my language. I think some of
Language of guilt, that is?
No. Well, no. Knowing firsthand some of the injustices that exist in the criminal justice system and the tremendous and very harmful effects of addiction. It's an issue that's really near and dear to my heart through a personal experience I think I've shared with several of you in the room and I shared with your team. And so I just want to thank you for your work. And I'm excited to bring something like this to New Mexico, and I think it could be a model for the country.
Let us help you. You've got some of our experts here who helped design it.
Oh, Alex and Samantha are in speed dial.
Yeah, good. We want this to be a national model, which means
Yes.
we want it in New Mexico. And attorneys general are well situated to help spearhead this model. And I know many of the attorney generals in your state, so if you want to do something like this in your state, let me know. Happy to loop in your attorney general. Because the position lends itself to creative problem solving, it lends itself to using moral authority, and it lends itself to working across stakeholders, those in the behavioral health world, those in the outdoor rec world, and those in law enforcement. And we've had great responses from prosecutors who are saying, I don't want to be prosecuting young people. I want a better option. And that's part of what we're going to prove here is there's a real win-win. Prosecutors want some way to have people take accountability. Restorative justice, doing this program is a form of accountability that will help people address their behavior, but in a way that is transformative, not unduly punitive.
Right. Thank you. Well, I'd like to go ahead and shift gears into a space of your work around protecting Colorado's natural resources through your, and I want to make sure I get this right, Natural Resources and Environment Division. You're working really hard to protect and improve Colorado's natural environment. Can you share specifically how your office is engaging in this? And perhaps you can touch on the Waters of the United States case, the Clear Car Standards, and/or your work to challenge the approval of the U.S. Bureau of Land Management's, I'm going to turn the page so I get it right, Resource Management Plan for the, oh gosh, now I'm really...
Compadre.
Thank you, sir. Yes. Can you speak to that? And how can we as an industry engage with your office and other elected officials to support those efforts?
I will say, and I had this visit 2.5 years ago, right after I started, you had a conference here in February. Your industry is growing up. In fact, many would say it's a grown industry. It has huge economic impact. Part of what that means, if you're not interested or into public policy, think again, because it's into you. Your industry depends on public policy actions. Climate change is the most alarming because we're seeing how a changing climate is having radical impacts, whether it's air quality, whether it's our water, whether it's wildfires. It's much more than that, however. And the three actions you mentioned all get to some think of as a weedy conversation or a wonky conversation. My message to you is please embrace your inner wonk and find a way to engage because it's important. The Clean Car Standards are an imperative because as we think about carbon emissions and how do we as a society address climate change, we need to deal with our transportation sector, which is a major emitter of greenhouse gases. The Clean Car Standards were first put in place by President Obama when the industry was bailed out here in the United States. And it was a pretty clear understanding. You're going to do better building vehicles that use less fossil fuels. Unfortunately, under our past president, Scott Pruitt, then head of the EPA, had other ideas. And he actually cut the standards way more than the industry asked for, and then also undermined the state authority under the Clean Air Act to have higher standards than the federal government. So we sued on both those accounts, and we were winning those lawsuits. Now we have a new administration committed to following the letter and spirit of the law and taking climate change seriously. I would much rather collaborate with a federal partner in Washington than have to litigate to defend our legal rights. With respect to the Waters of the U.S. rule, this was another painful step by both our EPA and then the Army Corps of Engineers, who said, we're going to take the Waters of the U.S. rule, which is a rule under the Clean Water Act, and we're going to gut it. We're going to provide less protection of water quality than has ever existed under this law. Our argument was the 2008 rule, adopted by the first President Bush, was a sound rule that enabled responsible development that went through appropriate due diligence and protected water quality. They didn't want any part of it, so they gutted the rule completely. We again had to go to court. We won in the district court. It was reversed on appeal for more proceedings, but again, we now have a new administration committed to constructive problem solving, protecting our land and water, so that's how we're going to approach that issue. And the final one gets to how we manage wildlife. As you all know, protecting wildlife is a critical part of our outdoor rec economy and ecosystem. And this was a situation where there wasn't even a properly confirmed government official who was making decisions and refusing to take seriously Colorado's input on a management plan. And so we had to sue there as well. Again, I'm looking forward to the opportunity to collaborate. And part of the challenge, part of why we need you engaged, these issues that I just mentioned, protecting our land, air, and water, should not be partisan issues. They're only partisan issues because so many people tune out once we get into the details. If you ask the American public, are you concerned about climate change? the number's like 70%. When you're on the side of a 70% issue, you shouldn't be losing major policy issues and having to go to court with state AGs protecting the rule of law. But that's where we were. So part of where I would challenge the industry is think about your broad public policy commitments, how it is important to your industry, and how do we elevate these issues so they're not vulnerable to partisan games playing, and it's more about core public health protections, core economic protections, and access to an outdoors that we can all enjoy. We have to recognize we're facing a range of challenges.
That's amazing. Thank you. You've talked a lot about a variety of issues, from criminal justice reform and your work to really institute diversion programs that take into account youth mental health. We talked about protecting land, air, and water. Thank you for reviewing those suits, and I completely agree. I think that really tapping into our inner want can only benefit us as a whole. So, in terms of benefiting us as a whole, how are you thinking about connecting these issues beyond Colorado, both in a way that you're working with other states to build on the models that you're creating here, and then also what's happening in other states that's exciting you that you're perhaps thinking of bringing to Colorado?
Let me try to pull a few of those threads and start with something I announced just recently.
Great.
I'm chair of this group called the Attorney General Alliance. It started out as the Western AGs. We now have honorary members such that we have most AGs a part of the organization. The initiative that I'm taking on as chair is called the Ginsburg-Scalia Initiative. And the premise is we want people to be engaged with one another in respectful dialogue, to learn from one another. Part of that means, for example, when we're closing down coal-fired plants in Craig and Hayden, Colorado, I want to learn from those communities and what that impact has on them and how we support them, how we work together to solve problems. That's a core brand of attorneys general. It's anchored in the rule of law, and it starts with honest conversations and relationships, that we're working together to solve problems. When I think about the water challenges we have here out west, we only do this through collaboration. If we end up litigating with other states around, for example, the Colorado River Compact, we are all losers. There's no winners, which means the spirit that I have, both within Colorado, the spirit we've talked about, with other states, with other AGs, is one of collaborative problem solving. And that's something I'm going to keep looking at, how we translate that spirit into progress. And part of what I am worried about is the overall cultural environment where issues can get polarized and where misinformation can be propagated, which can be around a range of issues. Criminal justice, the opioid epidemic, climate change. I believe in what Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said. Everyone has the right to their own opinion. I respect people with different opinions. I want to learn from them. People don't have the right to their own facts. We need to make sure we have conversations starting based on facts, and when there's misinformation out there, find a way to push back on it, and also to resist that toxic polarization that is getting in the way of leaders working together to solve problems.
Great. Something that we didn't talk about me asking you, but that sort of piqued my interest as you were talking about the coal-fired power plants and your work in that space, is the community engagement work that you're doing, and just the importance of making sure that we're talking to each other and that we're talking outside of our traditional circles of engagement, outside other policymakers and government administrators, that we're talking outside of the typical program providers that we have been working with and working together for years, and really broadening our scope of engagement. So can you talk a little bit about how your office is engaging community on these issues and the other issues that you're focused on?
My core belief is our democracy is a team sport. We need people showing up in community, listening. I just heard a podcast that talked about the values that someone leads with, and it was love, listen, learn. If we start with a spirit of love for one another, we listen to one another, we learn from one another, good things will happen. Let me mention Aaron Miltenberger, who's the head of the San Luis Valley Boys and Girls Club, who honors that spirit every day in how he shows up. And when I went down there, he talked about the opioid epidemic that was devastating his community. He talked about young people who could use a diversion program like what we talked about. And so Aaron's been an inspiration for me, and I know others have been for him, as we think about how we do this work. Part of how we cut through the polarization and cynicism, which is rising and, in effect, pushing people away from any political involvement because they're like, I don't want any part of it. The way we get away from that is by starting together on the local level, solving problems.
Absolutely. One thing that really excites me about this work and engaging new outdoor participants, specifically from youth and families from communities that have been underserved, is that we also have an opportunity to lift up just the real importance of advocacy, and that it can be this cyclical, the cycle that's beneficial to all, to really encourage our young people to advocate on behalf of the rules and create the landscape that we all want to live and operate in. So,
one quick pitch on that. If you're not mentoring young people in a shape or form, whether it's coaching high school debate or involved in a Boys and Girls Club or Big Brothers Big Sisters, I would encourage you to think, how do you get involved with young people? We have seen research on this. Young people who have a mentor, it could be a family member, it doesn't have to be, are so much more likely to thrive than those who don't say they have someone who cares about them. And all of us can be a part of that work.
Absolutely. That's great. Well, we want to give you all an opportunity to ask the Attorney General questions. So I believe Brian is walking around, or Tamara, I see somebody hustling back there, with a microphone. So does anybody have any questions for the Attorney General? I'm not an educator, but I'll call on someone.
Love that line.
Thank you, sir. What did you? Oh, and you're a dean. You're a professor.
I've used that line many times.
Hello? It is? Oh, sorry. I have to speak closer. My name is Matt Brady with Great Outdoors Colorado, which is a local funder of outdoor recreation and a number of other things. But what sort of runway? This is new to me, so as far as the runway you're getting with United Health, as far as years in the future, or because I know a lot of nonprofits often get funding for a year and then they scale up and have to scale back down, and I was just curious to know how you are dealing with that aspect.
Alex, how many years have we already locked in for funding? Is it 3 years? So we start with 3 years, and then it is on me to work with the program and its proof points to keep it going. Because you're right. We've had these programs like the one I'm talking about before. We've shown that they work, and then we fail to keep funding them. This is part of the problem in our system of government, which is there's certain nice-to-have programs that sometimes the funding falls off for, and then we end up funding the must-have programs, jails and prisons, even though the quote-unquote nice-to-have programs could relieve the stress and the expenses that get put on jail and prison.
I love what you just said in terms of the quote-unquote must-haves and nice-to-haves. I think that's a big piece of this work, right, is shifting the narrative from the outdoors and access to outdoors being oh, that would be nice to have. Truly, it is an essential piece of our lives, and truly does get to the root of why crime exists. If we can deter and treat mental health in the way that it needs to be, and addiction, perhaps we would have less crime that we would have to have those must-haves for. So thank you for that.
And part of it's realizing and taking the time, this is why the mentoring discussion fits in here, to ask someone what's going on with you. Mm-hmm. When someone does something at school, they're in a fight, or they act out in some other way, schools can say, we're arresting you, or schools can say, we want to talk to you about what's going on. And our messages start with communicating with an individual. Hey, how are you? What's going on? Why did you do this? Did you realize you hurt somebody else? That is a far more effective model. We issued a report in our office. You can look at it. It's linked to the Healthy Youth Strong Colorado discussions. And that's where we want to move the whole paradigm, as you put it.
Absolutely. Other questions? Oh, great. Yes.
Hi, I'm I'm not even sure if I need a microphone. Usually I don't. So I'm just trying to sort of get a good definition of what it means to have a fund. Like, what does that exactly entail? Is it programming that's being funded? Is it, just essentially like having youth within the group? My name's Ann. I'm from Saris. We just formed a foundation around building bike parks for kids, and directly aligned with these mental health challenges that are out there specifically for our older youth. Middle schoolers on through to high schoolers, we really feel like that's sort of the forgotten age range. There's a lot of good stuff out there for like the very small kids, but then all of a sudden you become like 10, 11, and then it's sort of the forgotten age. So we have focused on building these bike parks in, and having a private and public relationship so that we can, start putting these bike parks in places that are accessible to this age of youth, specifically urban. So my question, I think, is essentially what does that fund mean, and is there how are you like engaging our public lands, I guess I would say parks specifically, in all of this? Because let's be honest, they're not free. And creating infrastructure and creating places for these kids to actually be and learn new activities seems to be the biggest challenge that we're kind of confronting right now.
Okay, there's a few points in your question. Let me start off with a tangent and get close to the core of it. Part of what is really important, and I think it's worth reflecting on, is where are there best practices today that we learn from? So for example, if you go to Silverton, Colorado, they very seamlessly incorporate outdoor education and outdoor experiences into their schools, middle school and high school. So young people are growing up with that outlet that is both good for their mental health, right? Getting people outside the classroom, and then experiential learning. What we're talking about is creating that as an additional opportunity for more likely to be urban environments that would happen over the summer for a particular set of kids who are struggling, often with mental health, with their behavior, maybe academically, maybe all the above, and who are at risk for being treated as a criminal and put in the criminal justice system. This $1.8 million of new funding for these organizations will create new capacity that we will work with district attorneys' offices to say, hey, instead of moving ahead to prosecute, how about have what you might call a suspended sentence, which says if you do this program, we're dropping all the charges. That's a diversion program. Different form of accountability, which we believe will promise much better results. In addition to that $1.8 million, into that effort, we're giving $1.5 million. All the money's been accounted for in the fund, so it's not available, unfortunately. We are going to invest in Boys and Girls Clubs, many of which do programs like the ones you're mentioning, having young people do outdoors activities, whether it's in the Sand Dunes Valley, going to the sand dunes, or elsewhere. And if you know of Boys and Girls Clubs in your communities, whether here in Colorado or elsewhere, I strongly encourage you to think about how you partner with them. They're incredibly important. And then on top of this, I have not mentioned this yet, there are a few organizations that support mental health of young people, like the Center on Colfax here, which focuses on LGBTQ young people who are much more at risk of suicide. It's a hard time to be coming out, and we want to be able to support them, some of whom end up homeless as well. There's also a place in Colorado Springs that works on this as well. And then another program called Sources of Strength, which is in the schools, suicide awareness prevention to help save lives. I would like us to continue to find sources to support these programs after this initial period. It's going to be a collective challenge to think about how we do this. I welcome the outdoor industry's help supporting these programs, because as you think about your broader public mission, your community engagement, you have a natural nexus here around programs like the ones we're talking about that you can invest in your respective states. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. How do you deal with
Yeah.
for this to work? Like, what, great, the programming is there, but there's no place for this. Like, what are you defining as?
Well, the partners we have do have places that they're able to do their work in. I do agree with you that we have room to think about how we create additional places. And it's going to be opportunistic. So it's going to depend on different communities. Some communities, it is a more natural and obvious, hey, we have all these state or federal parks that we can use or beautiful outdoor spaces. Some, it takes some more creativity. So it's going to depend. And I think you want to engage your community and your elected officials in that conversation that we need to create these spaces. It's important.
It seems like, to the point about the cycle, the advocacy cycle, engaging new outdoor participants too, it seems like there might be a real opportunity, is it Anne, to see where there is overlap with folks that are doing advocacy work and potentially lobbying for capital outlay funds or other infrastructure opportunities. And maybe there's a role for the AG's office and, in terms of supporting those initiatives. I know, resources are finite, but funding urban green spaces is really, really important. And that's actually something that we're seeing in our research at the foundation, that new outdoor participants are recreating closer to home now more than ever. And so it's critical that we're investing in urban green spaces. So I really appreciate that point.
And let me mention one more resource that, Anne, you should have on your radar screen. It's called the Natural Resources Damages Trustee Council. Anytime there's any harm to natural resources, we hold those entities who harm our resources accountable, and then we have ways to, in effect, respond to and restore, and in some cases even create new opportunities like parks out of that tragedy. And so we've had a lot around Rocky Mountain Arsenal, for example, where we've tried to figure out how we use funds related to what happened there to build more outdoor opportunities. So there's a lot of opportunities for advocacy. Feel free to follow up with us.
Others, it looks like we have a question in the back.
You got one in the front row too.
One in the front and one in the back. Oh, I think, one second, Jacob. Is that?
It's okay.
Go, Jacob, go ahead. She wants you to.
Go first.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Thank you, Attorney General, for this very comprehensive conversation. I'm Jacob. I'm also with the Outdoor Foundation. And I really appreciated in the beginning you mentioned, how trauma lives in the body. I actually read a book called My Grandmother's Hands, which is about how racialized trauma lives in the body. And for me, nature is such a meditative place where I feel more connected to everything. I feel more empathy. I feel more present. So I was just wondering, do you envision there being a connection between increasing access to the spiritual, mental, physical benefits of the outdoors and building that society or a democracy that's willing to work together and to save our planet? Do you see there's a connection? I feel like I see a connection to it, but I would love to hear what you think about that, and if you've already envisioned programming that's kind of takes the aspect of nature being this really grounding place, and also how can that impact our policy and creating, policy that's really speaks to the interconnectedness of all of us.
I think it's a really powerful point. My first response is from your lips to God's ears. It is important. We're living at a time with greater toxicity, rising hate, increasing trauma. So how do we address what is a spiritual crisis, a mental health crisis, and also, in some cases, a physical health crisis? People's physical health isn't as good. Getting people outdoors, getting people walking outdoors, getting people talking to each other outdoors absolutely responds to those crises and builds connections. The spirit we talked about, relationships and collaborative problem solving here in Colorado, I don't believe is an accident. Because Colorado has this relationship to the outdoors, we are more prone to be collaborative problem solvers, to see one another, and to hopefully take time to reflect on trauma. So one thing that has stayed with me when I was in Colorado Springs talking about the opioid epidemic, a man was there with his son. He said, I took time off to be here to talk about the importance of responding to this epidemic because I lost my wife to this epidemic. She had a master's degree, and she ended up addicted to heroin and homeless. And he said, I lost my other son, also died of an overdose. You see the intergenerational trauma and addiction. And his son who was there talked to me afterwards, and I couldn't believe what he said to me. He said, I'm sorry about the trauma that your family endured surviving the Holocaust. Because he had that empathy. I'm not 100% sure where he got it from. But that was how he was leading around solving this particular problem, the opioid epidemic, which had so devastated his family. So if we can all live through the trauma that we have to feel, it stays with us, and come out of it with a sense of purpose and collaborative problem solving, we can address these issues and be stronger as a result.
Thank you very much.
That reminds me of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and wow, very profound. Thank you. I think we had a question in the back.
Yeah, hi, my name is Sierra. I'm an MBA student with the Outdoor Industry Program through Western Colorado University. And one thing I would love to get your thoughts on is the thought of the physical barrier of transportation for some of these participants to and from the locations, just because I know that can be a huge barrier, especially in larger cities. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
It is a challenge, and a few thoughts on how we address the challenge. One is the program we're thinking about is going to often take people over the summer, and so that's going to be one way to solve for it. There need to be other ways, and so for example, if you talk to the Boys and Girls Club in Denver and you ask, how are you getting people outdoors? I hope they have an answer to that question, which could be urban outdoor spaces, it could be organizing other outdoor gatherings. But I do think you're right, transportation is an interesting challenge. Ironically, for access to the outdoors, the transportation challenge is flipped than it is for our more rural communities around drug treatment. If you talk to people in Hayden, Colorado, in the northwest part of our state, the challenge is how are they going to get to the nearest drug treatment center, and they're going to have ways to manage transportation because that center won't be in Hayden. Where if you're in Denver, yeah, you have drug treatment in Denver, but you don't have outdoor recreation opportunities in Denver. So this issue comes up in a variety of contexts. We're having a broader conversation in Colorado about how we reimagine the 21st century transportation system. There are a number of different answers that we're going to be looking for, and it's important to keep asking the question.
Thank you.
Others? It looks like we have two. Perfect. Thanks, Paige.
Hi, Rachel Vermeil. I've been working in nonprofits for give or take 20 years in the outdoor space. Funding, GoCo, we all know it, is a challenge. This is a lot of money. This is a lot of big impact that can be made. I was wondering if you could speak to how you will be held accountable for the impact equity of the process of this. There's a lot of money is going to Boys and Girls Clubs all around, but how will you measure the actual equity of that impact? I think a lot of us as nonprofits, we think about that, as leaders in the industry, for-profits in the industry, but how will you be held accountable to that throughout this process?
I do want to emphasize first, we are not talking about spending public money. We're talking about our use of moral exhortation to get a private company that had no obligation and wasn't planning on doing this to do this in the first place. So with respect to spending public monies, like will happen with the opioid epidemic, there will be a lot of governance, input, decision-making. This was us convincing a private company to do this, and we were thinking a lot about equity as we designed what the money was spent on. So the outdoor education opportunity for young people are those who are at risk in the criminal justice system. So we think that's responding to a group that is underserved and that this can be a game changer for their future. With respect to the Center on Colfax and the place in Colorado Springs, LGBTQ young people who are at risk of suicide and often homeless, we think, again, we identified a core group. And then suicide prevention sort of goes across the board, and Boys and Girls Clubs across the board. We are going to need to ask each of our partners, how did you spend the money? Was it valuable? And the accountability is going to really be a lot on them, because if they can't account for how they spent the money and the impact it has, then the idea of follow-on money is going to be illusory. Our ability to bring more money to support these different programs is going to depend on delivering in an equitable way and an impactful way. And so we are going to be following them very closely, and I think that's where the accountability is going to come from.
Fantastic. I think we had a question over here. The gentleman, is that salmon? I think I'm colorblind.
Hello. Okay. Thank you. I'm Peter Lavaris. I'm a master's student at CU Boulder, but working extensively with my capstone team in Moffat County. So my question is related to, you mentioned the values of love, listen, learn, and I'm curious what that looks like in practice to you, because we've been engaging extensively with the community on the ground ourselves, but it seems like the battle lines are kind of drawn in the sand already. Whoever supports economic diversification supports it, whoever opposes it already opposes it, and that the viewpoints and the efforts of outsiders, if you will, are a tad less welcome. So curious how your office is actually engaging on the ground in these communities.
You show up and you do listen, and you have to recognize when you first show up, the trust deficit is high. The 5th, 6th, and 7th time you show up, people might start to think, wait, you actually care about Craig? And then you're in a position to be a part of addressing a shared concern. It was, I believe, my 4th visit to Craig when I visited with the head of the community college, who talked about an ambition to support a cybersecurity program there. I mentioned Craig is having a coal-fired plant being closed, which has a huge negative economic development impact. They are struggling mightily to ask what comes next. And if we don't have a path to a just transition for workers and people in Craig, shame on us. That would be another painful chapter. We can be there with our fellow citizens, friends, neighbors in Craig, coming up with solutions. You're going to have to work through that trust deficit. It's going to be there, because they're used to people flying through and not really caring. And that's true about African American communities here in Denver. And that's true in Latino communities in the San Luis Valley, indigenous communities in West Colorado. So my message is, don't give up. Hang in there, keep showing up, and then work on solutions together. We did that with the cybersecurity program. We now have a cybersecurity program that our office has funded, through a settlement we had with Equifax for their cybersecurity breach to support a program there in Craig. And we're going to be looking at money coming from the federal government around just transitions, asking how do we support Craig and Hayden, two wonderful communities that are under stress and strain right now.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. No? All right. Well, thank you all for your time, and thank you, Attorney General, for your time and for your work and your insights. Before we close, do you have any remarks that you would like to share?
I'll build on the last one. There's this great line from Scripture that says, you don't have the obligation to repair the world by yourself, but you're not free to desist from doing your part. All of us have a part to play in addressing this trauma, in repairing our world. What each of us can do and can take away is, what is our part? What does that look like? If you're looking for partners or ideas, talk to us in the Attorney General's office. Alex and Sam are here with me. Raise your hands so people see them. We'd love to partner with you. We'd love to support you. If you're in another state and you're thinking, I like what you're doing here in Colorado, how do I do that in my state with my Attorney General? Talk to us. We'll help you do that. This industry has an incredible role to play that is so responsive to this moment and responsive to what we're doing in the Attorney General's office, both protecting our land, air, and water, and helping people, and helping a criminal justice system that is more just, better protects public safety, and is aware of all the mental health and trauma issues that deserve to be addressed straight on and not as a side effect for people who end up incarcerated.
Thank you. I'd like just to emphasize the immediacy of this need and to really thank you all for your work and thinking creatively, because what we're not doing is, or what we're doing, unfortunately, is not enough. It's not working. We're losing our kids. The threats to our planet are greater now than they ever have been. And just thank you all for your work and your interest. and your time. And thank you, Attorney General.
Pleasure.
I do have a few minor housekeeping items that I will get fired if I don't talk about. Just kidding. Brian, where are you? I believe there is a survey, so you can scan the QR code here, or you'll also receive a survey link from OIA, and we really would love your thoughts and your feedback on this session. And I believe you all have tickets to the food trucks, woo woo, and Brian's waving me down for some reason. Oh, those are the tickets, okay. I didn't know if we were doing the YMCA.
You have to fill out the QR code to get the food
That's,
truck tickets?
oh, we should have done that. Talk about incentive. Give me food. We need the Attorney General on the Planning Committee. Brian?
Next year.
And I think that's it. In all seriousness, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, Attorney General.